On the face of it, Friday the 13th may not seem the most auspicious day to test fly a prototype aircraft, but nevertheless, in May 1949, that was the date selected for a new aircraft to take to the skies. And that aircraft was Britain's first ever jet bomber, and it marked the start of a remarkably long and successful career that would set new world records, as well as establishing a significant link here in Northern Ireland. The flight was a success. The aircraft was the Canberra.
It felt right, it looked right, it did the job particularly well.
Manoeuvrable, fast, you can see the aerodynamic shape of it.
The Canberra just seemed to be like a rocket.
Probably one of the most versatile military aircraft ever produced.
It was probably the world's best spy plane.
I can't big it up enough. It's been there, it's done it.
Another good product made in Belfast.
The Canberra was the aircraft, really was.
It was just a fantastic aircraft.
Despite the austerity of the post-war years, Britain had a vibrant and advanced aircraft manufacturing industry. Famous names like Avro, Gloucester, de Havilland and Hawker all competed to design and supply civilian and military aircraft. However, when the RAF decided to replace its ageing Mosquito propeller bomber, it was the English Electric Company that won the contract to supply the Air Force's first ever jet bomber.
The Mosquito was very light, twin-engined, and was used during World War II for a huge variety of tasks.
2 Merlin engines, a finely tuned wooden fuselage. We can make a bomber that can penetrate into occupied Europe at great speed, but we can do it in such a way that it's so stealthy, so fast, we don't need defensive armament on it at all. When you need 2 engines, it goes flat out. 1949, English Electric do the same concept again.
The idea was to harness the power of newly developed jet engines and marry those to an advanced fuselage and produce a world-beating aircraft. It was a wonderful design by the English Electric Company. There's a saying in aviation, if it looks right, it is right. And the Canberra looked right from the very beginning. A long, sleek tube, and you'd have a fighter-style cockpit. You've then got fairly large straight wings, and on each wing is a pretty big jet engine, an Avon engine. I think if one were describing the Canberra, sleek is the first word would come into your mind. And in 1949, extremely futuristic looking. Something perhaps that Dan Dare, the pilot of the future, might have flown.
It was a beautiful looking aeroplane. I think everybody in the business would agree with that. It did look right, and it was an exciting aeroplane.
In 1951, this sleek new aircraft was given the official name Canberra by the Australian Prime Minister at a ceremony in Biggin Hill.
To Biggin Hill, key defence point in the Battle of Britain, comes Mr Menzies, the Australian Prime Minister, to name Britain's new jet bomber after Australia's capital city.
When the Canberra was being constructed, the company thought that Australia would be a very good place to sell a version of it. And they decided quite cleverly to name the aircraft after Australia's capital city, Canberra, because they thought that would go down really well with the Australians and they wouldn't be able to resist buying the aircraft. It actually did sell to Australia, and indeed many other countries around the world as well.
Dripping Australian champagne, Canberra goes out to show Mr Menzies she's worth his trouble.
And to further highlight the abilities of the aircraft, a number of high-profile record-breaking flights were successfully undertaken. And it was one of these record-breaking flights that established Northern Ireland's first link with the Canberra, as RAF Aldergrove was selected as the starting point for a transatlantic speed record.
All-night work on Canberra nears its end as her crew receive briefing for their delayed Atlantic flight. Now she's ready and leaves the hangar under RAF police patrol guard. She's a top secret, a little something nobody else has got.
The man in the street would have first seen things happening in the press about the Canberra. That was it, crossing the Atlantic faster than anything else could do it.
4 hours, 40 minutes later, she made aviation history for Britain.
In the early 1950s, Canberras undertook several record-breaking flights back and forth across the Atlantic. One of those was flown by the Canberra test pilot, Roland Beaumont, and he broke the record and then promptly broke it again the next year. And then they did a couple of flights back and forth, twin crossings, again breaking the record.
The batsman gives the last signal and the Canberra's off to report 4 hours and 19 minutes later, a new record for Britain.
In those days it was very futuristic. I mean, the early Canberras were smashing altitude records and it was quite an amazing aircraft.
A Canberra jet bomber has set up a new world's high altitude record by climbing to over 63,000 feet, more than 12 miles high.
We always try and go faster and further, but there was actually a commercial purpose behind them, in that it put the Canberra in the marketplace. Other air forces, seeing what the Canberra could do, would think to themselves, oh, I'd like to have one of those. So certainly you had the advancement of science, the advancement of technology, but you also had the very sound commercial reason of let's sell more Canberras.
The first production Canberra entered service with the RAF in 1951, and by 1954 Bomber Command had 20 Canberra squadrons in the UK and 4 in Germany.
The first operational version was the B2, was a bomber. And the idea was that it could fly faster, it could fly higher and further than any existing aircraft type. The Canberra pilots quickly realised that if they were up flying around and they contacted a fighter squadron saying, would you like to come up and exercise with us, they could deeply embarrass any fighter pilots in the RAF, because they would take off and they couldn't catch the Canberra. And this was a great game. The Canberra pilots used to love this.
Well, from the very start, from the B2, they generated an aeroplane which was a fairly simple airframe, but it actually did the job exceptionally well and continued to do it exceptionally well. And it was rugged, and it was an aeroplane that was a joy to fly.
The fact that the Canberra proved so capable led to another significant Northern Ireland connection. The Belfast plane maker Short often built other manufacturers' designs under licence, and with English Electric struggling to keep up with demand, Shorts became one of the subcontractors for Canberra construction.
English Electric wasn't a very big company, so they had to spread the work around. Avro built some, de Havilland built some, and of course we built some over here in Shorts.
Well, Short's initial involvement with the Canberra family was in the 50s when they built the standard B2 Canberra.
Shorts built up 2 reputations. Number 1 was for advanced design, with a number of groundbreaking, technically advanced test aircraft. Secondly, in order to give them volume construction, they also built quite a number of aircraft for other companies. For instance, the Bristol Britannia. And that was really why they were involved, because of the skills that the company had.
The role of the aircraft changed over time, performing various tasks from bomber, tactical strike, interdiction, photo reconnaissance, electronic countermeasures, even meteorological research. Eventually, 773 Canberras served with 62 RAF squadrons worldwide.
One of the reasons why the Canberra lasted so long was because it could do so many jobs, was so versatile and was capable of being developed to do these different jobs. The basic airframe was so good and the engines were good that you could say, right, I wonder if the Canberra could do this job. And say, oh yes, it can, right, that's good.
Some went on to become target tugs, others went on to become unmanned drones, and the PR.9s were then converted into the photographic reconnaissance role that they are when they finished with the Royal Air Force in 2006.
The significance of the Canberra was also demonstrated by the fact that the type became the first of the post-war aircraft to be built under licence in the United States, a country not known for adopting foreign designs. It was also built under licence in Australia. In the end, 1,376 Canberras were built. Shorts produced 144 of the aircraft over a 10-year period between 1952 and 1962, and were solely responsible for building all 23 of the powerful PR.9 photo reconnaissance variants, generally considered to be the ultimate Canberra.
The PR.9 is definitely the ultimate Canberra. It was the one that was in service longest, and it was the one with the most sophisticated equipment on board. So yes, the PR.9 is the ultimate Canberra, and We built them here, all 23 of them, of which we can be very, very proud.
The Mark 9 photographic reconnaissance version strictly carried cameras, no bombs, no missiles, and the camera fit that it was actually using when it retired from service was probably the best camera fit of any aircraft in the world.
The purpose of reconnaissance was to see what was on the other side of the hill. And when aircraft first were introduced into the military, which was actually balloons in the French Revolutionary War, that's what they wanted to see, what was on the other side of the hill. And gradually, over the last, 200 years, we've got ever more sophisticated devices for finding out what the potential enemy is doing. Without reconnaissance, you're blind.
The RAF required a very stable, high-altitude photographic reconnaissance aeroplane, and Shorts had the design authority for doing that, and they put together an aeroplane which became XH-129. That was the first of the PR-9s. Unfortunately, it came to grief on a test accident off Blackpool. So 130 and 131 became the primary development airplanes. They were looking for an aeroplane that would be good at 55,000 feet. The PR-9 was designed to get to that altitude and be extremely stable, both sort of horizontally and laterally, to give you a good result with high quality camera equipment.
According to the Americans, it produced a far better photographic picture than the American versions and the U-2 spy planes could produce, even though it was the same equipment that was being used, the same cameras. I think it was just down to the build of the aircraft being a high wing and a big wing. It was just a more stable platform in flight at altitude.
That wing design that was built to support a high-level bomber became such a stable platform that allowed them to take really high-quality photographs of the ground. So it was an ideal sort of transition from a bomber into a reconnaissance airplane.
Whilst it was built as a bomber, because it didn't carry heavy equipment, it had uprated Avon engines, so it actually performed like a fighter, and the pilots who flew it actually loved it because it was so agile.
My recollection was that most of the pilots loved it, especially the PR-9, because the PR-9 had all that power. I mean, there was much more power there than in those engines than they actually ever used or could use. But no, they liked the aircraft, without a doubt.
The Canberra was a very versatile aircraft. It could fly at high, medium and low level. It could take a vast variety of different images. And if there was a reconnaissance job to be done anywhere in the world, because the Canberra had good range as well as good speed, that was the aircraft you'd send. It handled like a fighter as well. Some pilots have said to me it was rather like a GT sports car. If any aircraft could be described as fun, that's the Canberra PR-9.
Everybody that flew the PR-9 had I used to say, like a PR-9 look. You grinned, you liked it. Once it got fired up and it started to go, it is an extremely exciting aeroplane, even taking off.
Local connections with the Canberra were not just limited to record-breaking flights and aircraft construction. During its service life, maintenance and refurbishment on the aircraft were carried out both by Shorts and 23 maintenance units at RAF Aldergrove.
Shorts' involvement with the Canberra didn't stop when the last one was built. Shorts actually maintained and looked after the Canberras for the next 30 years after that.
The PR-9 started to come back to Shorts in 1970 for major servicing. The real interest then was to develop a capsule to hold the very latest version of the Lockheed spy camera. This was a much better version of the camera than the one that flew in the U-2. U-2 couldn't use it properly because it didn't have the stability. I mean, this was a serious bit of equipment. It was so serious that I never saw it. Although we had our security classifications, you only saw this thing if you needed to see it.
Apart from Shorts, Canberras were worked on at 23MU at Aldergrove right up until they withdrew from service. So there was literally thousands of people in Northern Ireland who served their time, worked on the Canberras either as maintenance fitters or electricians or paint sprayers. Such a widespread skill base.
This very aircraft that I'm sitting in front of, X-Ray Hotel 131, was the very first one I flew in, and its registration is imprinted on my mind. I'll never forget it. You know, my first flight nearly into orbit. The news was, the RAF Canberra's arrived, and I didn't know what the Canberra was. We knew there was a ship named the Canberra, a cruise ship built in Belfast as well, but I had no idea of what it looked like. So we eagerly left the office and went round to the front of the flight shed and saw this strange-looking military aircraft with the offset canopy for the pilot. So first of all, why is it offset like that, and where do I sit? And then somebody opened up the front nose with a hinge, and I thought, no, you must be joking. Sometimes the RAF would deliver to us, and other times we would pick one up. So generally, once we'd finished with the test flight and it was acceptable to return, we'd fly back down to RAF Whitton, which was the PR.9 base at the time, and we'd drop it off, go into the crew room, have a cup of tea, check the weather for the return flight to Belfast, and ask which one we were taking back. So they'd always point us to the one which was sitting on a turning circle and say, "There's your airplane." And there was always a bit of a wry look about them, you know, and it was only after I'd done a couple of deliveries that I realised what was going on, that the aircraft that we were to pick up, they knew we were going to refurbish it and take 2 years before they'd see it again. So what they tended to do was put all the unserviceable equipment back into this one that we were taking back, because they knew we would fix it for free. So it was a way of replenishing all their equipment again. So often on the way back, you know, we would have radios dropping out or various dials not performing quite well, and it was a bit of an adventure getting it back.
In contrast to the early well-publicised record-breaking achievements, much of the Canberra's service life is still shrouded in secrecy. Due to the clandestine nature of its role, many deployments remain classified. However, it is known that the Canberra had a significant role in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and also closer to home as part of Operation Motorman here in Northern Ireland.
Operation Motorman was in 1972, and it was clearing the barricades in what was known as Free Derry. And the Canberra was used for high-level photographic reconnaissance survey to take extremely high specification, high resolution pictures of what the situation was like on the ground. If we consider that the troubles went on for, well, some 30 odd years, the Canberras would have flown over here reasonably extensively. Now, it wasn't talked about, and we wouldn't really have known it was happening, because all you'd have heard was jet engines flying overhead, which of course could be an airliner. Other secret work that the Canberras did was they certainly flew over the bamboo curtain into China. They also crossed the Iron Curtain.
Everybody was aware that they did do what would be commonly known as spying missions, especially in the days of the Soviet Union. They were undoubtedly doing exercises very similar to Gary Power's U-2.
A lot of the Canberra's reconnaissance activities you would have to describe as being fairly covert, because obviously you really don't want potential enemies to know that you're looking at them and how much you know.
People say, well, you've got satellites now. The thing is that satellites are all right as long as who you're looking at doesn't know about them. The PR9s went in whenever they didn't know it was coming. It was either high or low level, and it actually supplied a service, second to none.
The Canberra was equipped with wet film, like 35mm film, same type. And in talking to photographic interpreters, quite interestingly, modern digital film, if you blow it up, eventually you're going to get pixels and lose the detail. Whereas apparently with a good enough camera, wet film, you can blow it up and get still the same amount of detail. So part of what the Canberra is able to do is in fact slightly irreplaceable.
They were used in various regions of the world for not just offensive missions, so spying, but doing reconnaissance and photography to help civilian agencies, on the ground, surveying an area, say to put a new road through or whatever.
The last Canberra, which was one of ours, was retired in 2006, and in fact our Canberra XH131 made the last operational flight in Afghanistan. And I know from the pilots that I've talked to that in Afghanistan the Canberra was the instrument of choice when they were wanting to do certain very specialised reconnaissance activities, which, were reasonably highly classified, so we can't know in exact detail what they were doing.
The Canberra served with the RAF for over 50 years. With airframes and engines reaching end of life, it would have been prohibitively expensive to refurbish the fleet. Also, the nature of photo reconnaissance was changing, with more emphasis on UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. In 2006, this Canberra, XH-131, the oldest surviving PR.9, touched down at Kemble for the last time. It was the end of an era for a faithful servant that had performed a crucial role for 5 decades. It had been built by Shorts in Queen's Island in 1958, and the Ulster Aviation Society decided to attempt to add it to their aviation collection.
Our collection has a theme of Northern Ireland related aviation memorabilia and aircraft. They built 23 PR-9s at Queen's Island and Belfast. XH-131 was the 3rd production aircraft and first flew in December 1958. The Canberra was an iconic aircraft. It was probably the world's best spy plane. The fact it was Shorts built and manufactured, she fitted in nicely with our collection.
Well, XH-131 was the last of its type to ever fly, and the last aircraft to land at Kemble when the RAF retired them. And throughout its service, it's seen sort of operational service in Bosnia, Second Gulf War, Afghanistan. It has a connection to Northern Ireland. It was built in Northern Ireland by Shorts, served with the Royal Air Force, and then came up for disposal. And it would have made a nice asset, a nice display here, bring the aircraft home really.
Well, when she retired in 2006, she had a crack in the main spar, so she was a non-flyer right from the word go. So the aircraft sat out for 4 years, from 2006 until 2010, before we actually went to work on it. The initial problem was, of course, it was at Campbell in Gloucestershire. It wasn't as though it was just down the road, so we had to, first of all, overcome the logistics of getting people over there to work on it. The aircraft is approximately 70 feet long by 70 feet wide, so taking it apart was quite a difficult job.
I think it was probably not knowing what we're going to come across. We were the first people ever to move a Canberra outside a military organisation or the manufacturers.
Well, it was in a dismal condition, let's put it that way, the mould and everything. It'd been there, 2 or 3 years, and it was really covered in moss and algae and everything. Order the engines had been taken out. Do you remember my first, we've got a hell of a lot of work here to do, to disassemble it.
My first impression when I saw it was, my goodness, how are we ever going to get this aircraft apart?
The main thing for taking the wings off, that there are 4 main fixing pins on each wing, about 1.5 inches diameter and about 1 foot long, which had to be extracted out. Now, it took me a whole day manually to jack one out. This is a waste of time.
We realised that with 7 more bolts, it was going to be another full 7 days' work just on detaching the wings. So we put out a widespread broadcast to see if there was anybody who could help us. A chap called Steve McMaster phoned me up, and he had actually worked on PR-9s in the Royal Air Force. So his first words were, do not attempt to screw the bolts out because they're inserted frozen. He said, what you need is a hydraulic extractor. This was the saviour as far as getting the wings off. The first pin was out in 12 minutes. There was drinks all round at that stage, I think.
There was a lot of nerves when the wings came off, when the wings were sat on pallets to the side of the aircraft. It was, how are we going to get these now moved?
We had managed to get both engines into a white van, and we got them home fairly quickly. So it was basically the fuselage, the wings and the tailplane came in 2 low loaders.
The day of the move, we'd had some very severe weather over here in Northern Ireland and in England. And it was a go, it was no go, and then it was on, then it was off. And eventually the haulage company said, we've got a weather window, we're going to move. The ferry arrived 8 o'clock on the Monday morning, and we couldn't move it again till that evening once all the roads were clear. So it was about midnight that the load was moved and escorted from Belfast docks to here.
process was, of course, getting it off the low loaders and into the hangar.
It was about 9 o'clock in the morning that the crane arrived. We knew we wouldn't get the wings in, and the crane would have to lift them over the compound.
We had quite a bit of help from other members of society in preparing the trolleys that we were going to set the wings on, for example.
We'd cleared the hangar the week beforehand so that the fuselage and wings could come in and just be left.
Quite a big aircraft, and when you see it sitting apart, you think, my goodness, this will never go back together again.
Bags of nuts and bolts all marked up, and it was a case of just going through all the bags, finding the right bit for the right part of the aircraft.
The first thing was to get the wings on. We got one wing on first where it was on the trolley, so we wheeled it over to the fuselage, get the first pin in, and then we had to sort of hinge the wing upwards to get the other pins in. So once you get one pin in, it's fairly easy.
We weren't left with any spare parts, which was an absolute godsend. You know, the last thing you want is someone to lift a bit and say, "Ray, where does this bit go?"
It was covered in a temporary finish, which was used for out in Afghanistan to protect it from the sun.
Then below that, there was a grey base coat, which was much more difficult to remove.
Probably over 1,000 handheld scouring pads to remove the finish. But once that came off, the original paint scheme and all the markings underneath were revealed, and it is as it is today now.
I'm so happy that it was 131 that the Ulster Aviation Society managed to bring back. Because it was the first aircraft through the more recent refurbishment, we did additional tests with it, so we spent a lot more time with it before we returned it.
I can't tell you enough how seeing her here in Northern Ireland, where she was built and conceived, it is so important. A lot of people in the province are probably of the opinion that, you know, yeah, okay, we knocked out quite a few Canberras, but this one is very special. And a very small fleet that was made, handcrafted, designed with absolute precision for a phenomenally difficult job, and done consistently, in this case, 37 years? That's a career.
I've flown Boeings and Airbuses and various other things in my aviation career. This was the aircraft that taught me more about flying than any other aircraft. Very exciting airplane to fly.
I think it's possibly the best value aircraft the RAF have ever purchased, and the PR.9 is the ultimate development of the Canberra. Fantastic airplane. It's a real shame that it had to go out of service, because as a reconnaissance platform, it was highly competent right up to the day the squadron disbanded. I've loved flying the Canberra, and I'm going to miss it.
For us, funding a project like this is as much about sort of reconnecting an aircraft which has really strong associations with Northern Ireland and bringing it back to its home as such. Canberra Connections is about connecting up with all those people who still live in Northern Ireland and are descended from people who will have worked on aircraft like this. And for us, that's extremely important. The fact that the society here are all volunteers, and they're keeping alive skills, and they're keeping alive interest in aspects of our heritage which would otherwise vanish. So for us, it's a fantastic project to be involved in.
Just over 20 years ago, I climbed into it, and we took it to RAF Whitton back to the customer and walked away from it and said, that's it over. These guys have just started it all again, which is brilliant.
The history of aviation is only 110 years since the Wright brothers first flew. So if we don't maintain that history, you know, what do we have to show future generations what we are actually flying? I mean, can you imagine what the aircraft will be like in 100 years from now? You know, I think it's such a great thing to look back on. And not just through modern media like internet or even books, but to have an actual example of an aircraft wing and the camber of it and just the shape and the view of the aircraft. It's absolutely essential that we preserve our heritage.
XH131 has finally returned home, and she's been painstakingly restored by the volunteers here at the Ulster Aviation Society. She now has pride of place within the aircraft collection, a fitting resting place for a truly remarkable aircraft.
It had a very, very distinguished career, and we hope we're now giving XH131 a very honourable retirement.
It's been a real privilege to fly in something so old that was designed and built long before I was born. I really had a genuine fondness for it. I had an immense sense of pride that we were keeping an aircraft going for such a long period of time.
Because the PR9s are part of Belfast and Short's history. An awful lot of people worked on the PR9s. My father worked on them, and yeah, the PR9 eventually became the jewel in the crown of all the Canberras.
It wasn't just a jack of all trades and a master of none. It was actually a jack of all trades and a master of a very good number of them. I don't think people realise just how big it is until they actually come in and see it. There really is a huge wow factor. I think it's a marvellous aeroplane.
It's a big mighty plane, and it's iconic in its design. It's a 1950s design that kept up to date with modern technology and flew until 2006, and it's just a shame they're not flying still.
It has made its place in history, and we're so pleased to have one in our collection. It is probably the crowd puller now as far as we're concerned.
It's lovely that this is its home in a way, that the Canberras come back home. All the PR9s were built here. The Canberra's got an enormous number of other connections with Northern Ireland, and we're deeply proud to have her here and to be a small part of the Canberra's history.